Здравствуйте, товарищи. Welcome back to Russian Through Propaganda. Today we're on day 52, and we're going to spend 2 days reviewing Russian verb conjugation, which is a huge topic, very important, unavoidable, also rather difficult in the sense that there are quite a few different patterns we have to learn in order to conjugate Russian verbs comfortably, right? And as with so many things in language, right, it's one thing to kind of be fed a table of the proper forms, and we learn them sort of by rote ultimately. And then we just have to practice, practice, practice until we develop that muscle memory that allows us to just do it without even thinking. And I can tell you from experience that it will happen eventually. With enough practice, you really don't give any thought usually to conjugating a verb unless it's some very unusual form that you hardly ever use in speech, right? So now also remember that the technique we're using in this book is very systematic and very exhaustive, right? It would be nice to think that, oh, all Russian verbs conjugate according to just a handful of patterns, like 2 or 3 different conjugations. And a lot of textbooks, by the way, will give you that impression. But of course, by the time you've learned, I don't know, a few dozen Russian verbs, you realize very well that that kind of a simplified system isn't ultimately very good because there you end up with exception after exception after exception, right? And every new verb, you never know what to expect with it. So what we've tried to do in this book is use a system that gives you everything, right? You see the full picture. You can turn to the table at the back of the book and maybe look over it, see how many verb types are familiar to you at this point, and which ones we haven't seen. We're going to be adding a few more pretty important ones later in this book, and then we'll cover the final few in book 3, I believe. Right, but if you look over the table, you'll see that most of the types have already been covered, especially the most common ones. So maybe this isn't quite as bad as it seems. And I think in a way it's comforting to look at that table. And while there's a lot of information on it, if you realize that if you know what's on that table, you basically should be comfortable conjugating almost any Russian verb. I think that's a fairly comforting thought, right? And at least it helps us realize that there's nothing lurking out there that's so strange that we won't know how to conjugate it. Now, remember, when we're talking about verbs, I'll make a few kind of blanket statements about Russian verbs today. Remember that there are a very few verbs that are truly irregular, right? Which will break all sorts of different rules, right? But we have to remember in Russian that that's actually very unusual. There are really only a handful of truly irregular verbs. We've seen almost all of the common ones already, and we'll review them, I think, maybe tomorrow. But again, the vast majority of Russian verbs are regular in the sense that they belong to one of the conjugation types on that master table in the back of the book. Now, of course, some types are much, much more common than others, right? So that helps explain why some textbooks will say, well, this verb, yamagu, możesz, может, right? They'll say, well, that's kind of an irregular verb or something, or it's just weird in some way. Well, not really, right? It belongs to a class of verbs. I call them g obstruents. There are other verbs in that same family. And of course, they're not nearly as common as verbs like делать or читать, right? But they're still a type, and so we list them as such. Now, remember that without question, this system we're using is artificial in the sense that Russians do not use it, right? Why would they, right? They just learn how to conjugate their verbs as they're growing up, and they never give a passing thought to it. Well, we're not so lucky, right? We have to learn these patterns. Now, keep in mind, I always like to point out that it doesn't matter what we call them or what system we use to classify these different patterns. The patterns exist, right? There are a certain number of patterns in the language. This is not something that I'm making up in order to make life difficult, right? I'm simply trying to take account of the reality of the rather wide variety of conjugation patterns we have in Russian. Now, what do we call these patterns? Well, we could call them, classify them numerically and say pattern 1, pattern 2, or whatever. But instead, we've tried to name these in a way that's somewhat meaningful in terms of learning something about the way the verb was formed. For example, I verbs are called that because all these verbs were created by taking a root and adding the verbal suffix I to it. And because those vowels all share the same suffix, verbal suffix, they all tend to behave in the same way, right? So that things like that historically explain how these patterns came into existence. And now, but at the same time, keep in mind that in theory, you don't really have to know anything very technical about, say, I verbs and how they were formed. The point is we have to become aware of the pattern. We have to know which verbs, as we're learning verbs, we have to know which pattern they belong to, right? Which verbs are I verbs. And we have to keep practicing until conjugating an I verb becomes something we could do in our sleep, right? So we start out with a head verb like chitать. We learn the pattern, chitayu, chitaish, chitayat, etc. And when we encounter a new I verb like делать, we just put it through its paces, right? Делаю, делаешь, делает, right? It's the exact same pattern that we know. The more we do it, the more familiar it will become. And that's why, by the way, one of the best tips I think I can give you is that as you're uh, using the book, you're getting new vocabulary, and especially down the road when we start reading texts, right, which we will at the end of book 2, you're going to get a lot of unfamiliar vocab, right? But we're going to always flag the verbs. We're going to tag them in terms of which verb type they belong to, and knowing that, in theory, you should be able to just ring off the conjugated forms, no matter how weird the verb is. And again, if you train yourself to just insist on practicing every new verb, every new I verb you encounter, to just insist on running through the conjugation, the more you do it, the more your sort of muscle memory will develop. And in time, you'll realize that you're doing it without any thinking at all, really. Okay, let's start out by reviewing what are the big groups of Russian verbs. Well, we can group all Russian verbs, again, all regular verbs, into two big groups. Verbs that take the so-called yo endings and verbs that take the e endings. Okay, today we're going to look at verb types that take the yo endings, of which there are a far greater number than verbs taking the e endings. So we're going to see today quite a variety of verb types, but they all take the same endings, yo endings. Now remember that if the ending isn't stressed, we're not going to see yo, right? We can't see yo in Russian in an unstressed position. So what we call the yo endings will actually turn out to be, so to speak, yeah endings if the endings are not stressed. Okay, let's look at a table, right, and quickly just review what we know about Russian verbs. We know quite a lot about them, actually. And I think, again, hopefully that should be comforting, right? We know quite a bit about aspect, the basics of aspect, imperfective versus perfective. We know how the vast majority of Russian verbs come in aspectual pairs, right? Like читать, прочитать. We know how those two infinitives are treated in terms of the three Russian tenses, right? Only three tenses in Russian. Present tense has to be imperfective, right? Because it's by definition ongoing. In the past, we can have perfective or imperfective. In the future, we form the future tense for imperfective verbs using a helping verb like я буду читать. Meanwhile, for a perfective verb, we simply conjugate the form the way we're going to be practicing today. We conjugate the perfective infinitive like прочитать, and the resulting forms are future tense automatically. Я прочитаю, ты прочитаешь, etc. Okay, so that's all review. Now let's go through the types here we've learned, and remember that a type basically has two things we need to know about it in terms of how it's going to conjugate. We need to know, first of all, does it mutate and what endings does it take, right? So remember, all the ones today are going to be taking yo endings. We have to be watching out for mutations in certain types. And let's quickly review the mutations, right? We've seen almost all of them at this point, right? There's one little wrinkle we're saving for later, I believe near the end of book 3, excuse me. But for now, we've seen most of the major mutations, right? So for example, an S in Russian mutates to a sh, a ka mutates to ch, right? Z to zh, etc. Da also to zh, right? So we've seen all of these. We have a couple of cluster mutations, right? S ka together mutates to sh in certain positions. S te together mutates to sh. Finally, labials add a soft L in their mutation. So b becomes blya, right? Blya with a soft L, right? And then, of course, we add endings to that. Okay, so let's not spend too much time on this. Again, you can go back to material in book 1 if you want a more detailed review. Let's just go type by type, run through the head verb, and then practice conjugating, filling in some blanks for other verbs belonging to the same type. Okay, I verbs like читать take yo endings and never mutate. So читать is our head verb. The forms are читаю, читаешь, читает, читаем, читаете, читают. The imperative, which we've also talked about, would be читай, читай. Now remember, that's just the t imperative We could add tia to that to get the vui imperative like chitайте. Okay, so let's run through that one more time. And again, this is how you should be practicing it, right? Chitать, take your head verb, and let's repeat it, and I'll give you time, hopefully, to repeat after me. Читать, читаю, читаешь, читает, читаем, читаете, читают, and finally, читай. Okay, so let's take a few more I verbs and just watch for what subject we have in the examples and choose the right form of the verb to go with its subject. Сегодня я занят. I'm busy today. I'll do everything tomorrow. Okay, so сделать, you may remember that's a perfective verb. So when we go and conjugate this, the result is going to be future tense. Я все сделаю завтра. Я все сделаю. I'll do everything. I'll get everything done tomorrow. Perfective. Терять means to lose. Now here we have the ya instead of the a, but it's still an I verb. Why are you always losing your umbrella? Почему ты все время теряешь зонт? Number 3, when he was little, he would always help his mother. Okay, so past tense, by the way. So watch out. In some examples, we may need past tense. Now remember, the past tense is formed almost always straight from the infinitive, right? So the past tense typically is much easier than the present, the conjugated forms we're learning, that we're focusing on today. Когда он был маленьким, он всегда помогал маме. Помогал, right, to go with one. Okay, number 4, we often study in the library. Okay, that's no reason to choose past tense there necessarily. Мы часто занимаемся в библиотеке. Мы часто занимаемся в библиотеке. Now remember that with reflexive verbs, all we're doing is tacking that reflexive particle onto the end of the form, right? The form itself, in this case, мы занимаем, there's nothing unusual about that. We just conjugate it, and then we add the ся on at the end. Мы часто занимаемся. Okay, verbs like писать take the yo endings, and they mutate in all forms. All forms, right? So we're starting out with писать, and the s is mutating in all forms to a sh. Right? So let's review that pattern. Писать, пишу, пишешь, пишет, пишем, пишете, пишут. And finally, пиши, right? The imperative. Now remember that form can depend on the stress, right? There's more to be said about the imperative, but again, you can go back and review that in book 1 if you like. Okay, let's start with some examples here. Now remember that here we're marking the stress, right? We do that hopefully in the book when it's ambiguous, right? That is when the infinitive is stressed on the final syllable, right? Those are the instances in which typically we can't guess the stress pattern, or quite often we can't guess it. And so we're going to add that in addition to the verb type. All right, so if we say that написать is a shifting stress a verb, we mean that it's going to be stressed on the ending in the ya form, but elsewhere the stress will jump back onto the stem. Right, so I'm busy today, I'll write him tomorrow. Okay, so again, conjugating a perfective verb, the result is future tense. Я занята сейчас. Я напишу ему завтра. Number 2, ask him to show you the new puppy. Okay, here we need an infinitive, right? So we don't need to conjugate it actually. Ask him to show, right, the new puppy to you. Попроси его показать тебе нового щенка. Number 3, заплакать, to start crying, perfective. When they find out that there's no cake, they will start crying. Okay, so future tense, perfective verb. Когда они узнают, что торта нет, они заплачут. Они заплачут. Okay, watch the mutation there from ka to cha. Number 4, казаться, to seem, right? It seems to me now that he's telling untruth. He's saying untruth. He's not telling the truth. Теперь мне кажется, что он говорит неправду. Мне кажется. Okay, ova verbs. Remember, there are tons and tons of ova verbs. A lot of them are borrowed. and they're very easy to conjugate as long as you remember that the ova, that little verbal suffix, contracts into simply an u in the conjugated forms, right? So ova becomes u, and then we add on the yo endings. The pattern is рисовать, я рисую, рисуешь, рисует, рисуем, рисуете, рисуют. And then the imperative рисуй, уй, right in that imperative. Okay, so ova verbs, sometimes depending on the 5-letter spelling rule, we may write yeva as in танцевать, but that's still basically an ova verb. Okay, you dance well. Where did you learn to dance? Ты хорошо танцуешь. Где ты научилась танцевать? Right, we need the infinitive there. You learned to dance. Okay, what are they planning for Friday and Saturday? Что они планируют на пятницу и субботу? Number 3, here's an obvious borrowing, right? Emigrirovat, to immigrate, right? So remember that with these ova verbs, you can typically guess what they mean because almost all of them are borrowed, right? Very easy to guess their meaning and very easy to conjugate them. When he was a child, his family immigrated to the U.S. Okay, so this is obviously past tense, right? This is a past tense situation. So here we're going straight from the infinitive. Когда он был ребенком, его семья эмигрировала в США. Эмигрировала, right? Drop the soft T from the infinitive, add L, and that's our starting form for the past tense. Okay, number 4, тренироваться, to train oneself or be trained. Я спортсмен, я тренируюсь каждый день, right? I train every day. Я тренируюсь каждый день. Okay, what about avai verbs? Okay, in terms of common mistakes, even in like second-year Russian, avai verbs cause trouble all the time. So again, I would really circle this. If you're really insisting on mastering Russian, you definitely want to learn these avai verbs, of which there are basically only 3, right? If we don't count prefixed forms. Now, we're going to talk more about prefixation later in this book, so more on that later. But for now, again, all avai verbs are going to end in either davat, stavat, or znavat. There are no other basic avai verbs. Okay, here's the pattern. Davat, dayu, dayosh, dayot, dayom, dayote, dayut. And the imperative, davai, right? So there the v remains and we get davai. Okay, some examples. Why are you giving the child candy, right? Why are you giving candy to the child? Почему вы даете ребенку конфету? Number 2, вставать, to get up. Every morning we get up and we head straight for the kitchen. Каждое утро мы встаем и идем сразу на кухню. Number 3, продаваться, to be sold. Okay, so again, a passive verb. We've got the reflexive particle, but that doesn't affect the conjugation pattern. We're asking, is beer sold in this store? Пиво продается в этом магазине? Right, продается. Узнавать means to find out or recognize. Do you recognize him? He's got a new haircut. Ты его узнаешь? У него новая прическа. Okay, next type is the nu type, right? All built using the verbal suffix nu. These are sort of like ova verbs in the sense that they're very easy to spot, right? They're very easy to spot and also easy to conjugate in theory. They take yo endings, they don't mutate. Remember to keep the n. So, for example, отдохнуть, я отдохну, ты отдохнешь, он отдохнет, or она, or оно, right? Мы отдохнем, вы отдохнете, они отдохнут. And the imperative for this one would be отдохни. Okay, let's take a few more that we've seen. Вернуть. He will return the book to the library tomorrow. Okay, they're without the reflexive particle. Он вернет книгу в библиотеку завтра. Now, with the reflexive particle, we get an intransitive meaning, right? To return oneself, so to speak. That is to go back somewhere. Вернуться. They tomorrow literally will set out by vehicle for Moscow, but they will soon return. Okay, so this is a perfective verb. We conjugate it, we get a future tense meaning. Они завтра поедут в Москву, но они скоро вернутся. Right? Они вернутся. They will return. Number three, привыкнуть. When he was in Russia, okay, past tense, right? Он был в России. He quickly got used to the cold. Okay, so we need past tense here. And remember that we have a little subtype of new verbs that we write using parentheses. We call those disappearing new verbs. The only place where they behave unusually is in the past tense, where the nu, that suffix, simply drops out. Okay, so the past tense forms of привыкнуть, which is a disappearing new verb, would be привык, привыкла, привыкла, привыкли, right? The new suffix simply disappears, and then we add L in front of the endings a, e, etc. Okay, anyway, let's look at this example. When he was in Russia, he quickly got used to the cold. Когда он был в России, он быстро привык к холоду. Right? Привык is the verb. Again, so привык, we've simply dropped the nu with no L, right? But if we had the feminine version of that, the L reappears, and we say привыкла. So we could say она быстро привыкла к холоду. Okay, what about ye verbs like уметь? Okay, these are kind of like I verbs, really, but just a different, instead of a, we have ye. Уметь. Я умею. Ты умеешь. Он, or она, умеет. Мы умеем. Вы умеете. Они умеют. Okay, so to know how, the imperative would be умей. Okay, we haven't had a whole lot of verbs like this, but let's practice a couple. The child of your sister, right? Your sister's child already knows how to swim. Ребенок твоей сестры уже умеет плавать. Right? Sorry, I didn't realize that was a question, right? Ребенок твоей сестры уже умеет плавать. Right? The question is, does he know how or doesn't he? So the rising and falling intonation falls on умеет. Он умеет плавать. Number two, успеть, to manage in time. A hurry, or we, again, will not manage to make it in time onto the train, basically, if we kind of think about that literally, right? Успеть, we're trying to get there in time. Or as we'd say in English, we won't make it to the train. We won't catch the train. Спеши, а то мы опять не успеем на поезд. Мы не успеем на поезд. Three, a lot of ye verbs are built from adjectives, and they mean to become whatever the adjective is. So, for example, стареть means to become starый, right? That is, to become old. So it seemed to him that he had begun to quickly get old. He had begun to age quickly. Okay, so a past tense sentence here, but what we need is an infinitive, right? He had begun to get old. Ему показалось, что он начал быстро стареть. Стареть. Okay, let's look now at a big group of verbs. If you look at the table, the whole bottom half actually are what we call non-suffixed verb types, meaning that they're conjugating basically by simply adding the endings directly to the stem. There's no intervening verbal suffix the way we've seen so far, like I, ye, nu, ova, ava, etc., right? We're simply taking a stem and adding the endings directly to that stem. Now, typically, again, you can go to the master table and look these over, and you'll see that they're all behaving more or less in the same way. That is that the stem, the last bit of information in the stem, it may be the final letter, maybe a couple of letters, is typically not clear from the infinitive. So to take the simplest example, the first example, жить, the stem of that verb is živ, right, to which endings are added directly. So what happened is that the infinitive ending basically swallowed up that final consonant, and so instead of having živt, we're left simply with žit, meaning that the infinitive doesn't give us the stem we need to conjugate this verb. We have to know that it's a v verb, namely that its stem ends in v, and we're going to first recover that stem živ, and then add the endings directly to that stem. So once we know the stem, conjugating these is typically very easy. We're just adding the yo endings. Okay, so let's start with a verb like жить, right? Жить, we call that a verb, meaning that v is the final consonant in the stem. So our pattern here is живу, живешь, живет, живем, живете, живут. And the imperative here for this one would be живи, right? We have живу in the ya form, therefore we have живи in the imperative. Okay, let's ask, where are they living now? Earlier, they lived in Moscow. Okay, где они живут теперь? Okay, earlier they lived, that's past tense, so we would say раньше они жили в Москве. Okay, in his childhood, he lived in the village, while she lived in the city. Okay, so again, we have a clue here that we need past tense. В детстве он жил в деревне, а она жила в городе. Okay, you may remember that some verbs in the past tense, a few verbs, especially verbs with monosyllabic infinitives, the feminine ending, the a, takes stress in the past tense forms. So watch out for that pattern. Here we saw it right, on жил, but она жила, она жила. Okay, number 3, плыть, which also follows that pattern, by the way. Where is this ship underway by water today? Remember that motion verb, how we could unpack that, right? Is the ship sailing to Helsinki? Куда плывет этот корабль сегодня? Right, so there our subject, of course, is корабль. Doesn't matter if it comes after the verb, right? It's still the subject of the sentence. Корабль плывет, плывет. Куда этот корабль плывет сегодня? Helsinki. Okay, let's take an oi verb like мыть. Again, we say this is an oi verb. We see that oi is not present in the infinitive, so we just have to recover that and then add the yo endings directly to that. Now, by the way, when we start adding ye or yo to the root, the stem moi, then the краткое, the ye is going to disappear just because of spelling conventions. So the pattern is мыть, мою, моешь, моет, моем, моете, моют. And the imperative is мой, мой, right? Which we see in this case, as sometimes happens, that is actually the stem of the verb. Okay, today I'm washing the dishes. Why do you never wash them? Я всегда мою посуду. Почему ты никогда ее не моешь? Right? Почему ты не моешь посуду? Number 2, петь. Okay, that, by the way, is an in-stressed oi verb. So we're going to get пою, поешь, поет, etc. Some bird is singing every morning, literally behind my window, beyond my window, or we'd say outside my window. Какая-то птица поет каждое утро за моим окном. Number 3, he suddenly opened the door and said, hello. Okay, so our clue here is the second verb, сказал, right? We have a past tense sequence here, so we look at the context. We have enough to know that we need a past tense here. Он вдруг открыл дверь и сказал привет. Он открыл дверь. 4, закрыться, okay, a reflexive form here, also an oi verb. For some reason, the store is closing early tomorrow. It will be closed, literally, right? We're getting the reflexive pattern. It will close itself. It will be closed. We need the reflexive particle. Магазин почему-то закроется рано завтра. Магазин закроется. Закроется. Now remember, we could drop the particle закроет, and we could say things like, he will close the store, right? Он закроет магазин, or he will close the door. Он закроет дверь. Right? Again, the slight difference in meaning in terms of whether we add the particle or drop the particle. Okay, a soft sign verb like пить, right? Its stem is going to end in a soft sign. So the pattern is пить, пью, пьешь, пьет, пьем, пьете, пьют. And the imperative is пей, пей. Okay, let's take a few of these. You're drinking too much. You need to drink less. Or literally, it is necessary to drink less. It's a fairly common phrase in Russian. Ты пьешь слишком много. Пить надо меньше. Okay, number two, the perfective version of that, выпить, right? To drink up, to finish drinking. Hard to believe, but she drank up all the kvass yesterday. Okay, again, our clue here is вчера. That's telling us that we need a past tense verb, right? Otherwise, it wouldn't make sense. Трудно поверить, но она выпила весь квас вчера. Right? Она выпила. Number three, beat, to beat or strike. This kid is all the time, right? He's constantly beating his brother. Так нельзя, right? It can't be like that, right? That's not right. Этот ребенок все время бьет своего брата. Так нельзя. Right? Нельзя бить своего брата. Number four, лить, to pour. Okay, a little stock saying, kind of nice. The rain is pouring as if out of a bucket, right? Meaning it's raining cats and dogs. Дождь льет, как из ведра. Дождь льет, как из ведра. A ведро is a bucket. Okay, a few non-syllabic verb types. These are a bit tricky, and again, we're getting into sort of some technicalities here, which you can sort of take or leave ultimately. But the names we give these types involves a forward slash, and that's basically a little placeholder for the position that would normally be occupied by a vowel, right? If the stem had a vowel baked into it, we would have it, but the stem is actually non-syllabic, meaning it doesn't have a vowel. It doesn't itself constitute a full syllable. And so again, look at the example, начать. We call that an in, a non-syllabic in verb, we could call it. Basically, that means that the stem is going to end in ch, n, right? Some consonant, some initial consonant that we can typically see in the infinitive itself, in this case, ch, and then a second consonant that typically isn't seen, or at least possibly not seen in the infinitive. In this case, that's n. Okay, so once we recover that, we're off to the races, adding the yo endings. Начать, to begin. Начну, начнешь, начнет, начнем, начнете, начнут. And the imperative начни. Okay, so let's say the professor will begin the lecture in 5 minutes. Профессор начнет лекцию через 5 минут. Let's start with this poem, right? Let's start with this poem. Now, here is a common mistake. This idiom is a bit weird. I'm not sure we've talked about it yet. In Russian, you begin from something, right? So, s, as we know, can take the genitive. It can also take the instrumental. So this is confusing because in English we say, let's start with this poem or something. But in Russian, what we're actually saying is, let's start from this poem, right? And so for that reason, the s here is followed by the genitive. You can understand how, because of interference from English, students of Russian will often say, let's start with, and they'll use the instrumental instead of the genitive, and that's a mistake. Okay, so anyway, remember that after давайте, we typically use a мы form of the verb, right? So давайте начнем, right? Let's begin with this poem. Давайте начнем с этого стихотворения. Number three, the opera will begin today at 8 o'clock. Opera начнется, right? Начнется. We could think of that as an intransitive verb, right? It will begin. It's not that the opera is beginning something else. It itself is being begun, right? It's starting intransitively at 8 o'clock. So we use the reflexive particle and we say, Opera начнется сегодня в 8 часов. Finally, one of the weirdest and, unquestionably most artificial type names we have here are the so-called NSA verbs, which have a non-syllabic stem NSA followed by a stem vowel a, right? So these actually aren't non-suffixed. They do have a suffix a in the infinitive, but the a drops out in the conjugated forms, right? So this is a very tricky type. Now look at the example, right? Again, for some of these, it's maybe not worth too much time unless you're kind of a language geek, right? If you're into that kind of thing, that's great. But at the end of the day, you just look at the pattern and kind of get a sense of what's going on there, right? Ждать, ждать, right? That verb is built up with a non-syllabic stem, namely je, de, right? Жда, жда, right? Non-syllabic, followed by an a in the infinitive, but that a vanishes in the conjugated forms, right? So for example, we get жду, ждешь, ждет, ждем, ждете, ждут, and the imperative жди. Okay, now there are a few little subtypes of this type. You might want to look in the back of the table, right? Some of them will insert a vowel, right? They'll insert either an or a yeah in between those two consonants in their stem, right? So watch out for that. For example, brать. That's biru, biryosh, biryot, right? So it's inserting a yeah in between those two, right? Basically in between the N and the S position. In between, in this case, the B and the R. Okay, so let's ask, does she usually take her umbrella with her in the morning or not? Она обычно берет зонт с собой утром или нет? Literally, does she usually take umbrella with herself in the morning or not? Она берет зонт или нет? Okay, number two, звать. That inserts an or, right? So again, that's somewhat unpredictable. We have to learn that on a verb-by-verb basis, right? Some NSA verbs will insert a yeah or an or. Some will insert nothing at all, like ждать. Okay, so we know this idiom. How do they call you, literally? Как тебя зовут? Okay, so звать conjugates like зову, зовешь, зовет, etc. Как тебя зовут? The answer, they call me Боря. Меня зовут Боря. Okay, and finally, the verb we've already seen, ждать. My sister will arrive in an hour from now. We are already waiting for her at the train station. Сестра приедет через час. Мы уже ждем ее на вокзале. Right? Мы ждем. Okay, so a lot to take in there. Now, the good news is that hopefully that was review. But again, at this stage of your Russian, if you're serious about the whole Russian thing, right, it would be great to really nail down these patterns. We've practiced them quite a bit. We're going to keep seeing them over and over again. Now, at this stage, you also might sort of take stock of which verbs you know well, which verb types you know well. Hopefully, some types like I verbs and ova verbs you're quite familiar with because there are so many of them in Russian. Some of the other types, like the NSA verbs, you might need to practice a little bit because there aren't nearly as many of those verbs. But again, there are a fair number of verbs belonging to any given type. So as you keep going through Russian, you're definitely you're going to want to know all of these verb types well, right? So that any Russian verb you encounter, you'll be able to just ring off the forms, hopefully without a whole lot of effort. Okay, so that does it today for the major types we've seen that take your verbs, that take your endings. Tomorrow on day 53, we're going to look at the types. There aren't very many of them, by the way, that take E endings. And that will conclude our review of Russian verb conjugation. Until then, до свидания, товарищи, и вперед к новым победам.